level. Efficiency and data sharing leads me to the important message that we must forge ahead with to make granular information available to researchers through data laboratories and thus multiply the usefulness of the enormous amount of information that we handle. In this regard, national central banks and other authorities need to coordinate to make microdata from complementary sources available to researchers, to external researchers. Another aspect of data sharing relates to the idea of collecting the information only once and consistently. We are trying to move in this direction as regards reporting by credit institutions with the integrated reporting framework, which will harmonize standards and will also standardize and integrate existing European system central bank requirements for collecting statistical information from bank accounts and banks across statistical domains and countries. Likewise, we might ask whether a similar approach could be used for multinational enterprises. Indeed, multinational enterprises need to report already now a large amount of information in different regions in compliance with different reporting regulations. Any effort to standardize such reporting would surely imply a lower burden on these enterprises and result in more consistent and better quality information for the authorities and ultimately sounder assessment and policy analysis. So let me conclude. High quality and timely external statistics that also minimize the burden on reporting institutions are absolutely essential. And I'm pretty sure that during these 2 days, you will be available and you will be able to raise the many challenges that lie ahead and ensure that these data are fit for the high purposes for which they are needed. And of course, I also wish you a very pleasant stay in Madrid. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everyone. This is Juan Peñalosa. I'm the head of the Statistics Department at the Banco de España, and it's a pleasure for me to open this first session of the conference. This session focuses on alternative ways to measure cross-border exposures. In particular, we are going to see the different perspectives that nationality-based measures provide as compared to the standard residence-based statistics. So in this session, we are going to look through standard statistics, our current statistics, and our presenters will shed light on what we are missing when analyzing our statistics based on a residency principle, on the basis of microinformation available from public sources, but also private ones. And they will show the beauty of microdata, but also the limitations of our current statistical toolkit. I think we are going to highlight the importance of offshore centers and financial centers. Some of them are more exotic than others, as you will see. And for sure, we are going to see the implications for many aspects of our judgment about the economy, about policies, monetary policy, financial stability. We are lucky to have 3 outstanding speakers with us today: Carol Bertó, Martin Smith, and André Sánchez Pacheco. They will have 15 minutes each for their presentation, and they will pick up some questions at the end of the session. Let's then start with Carol. Carol Bertó works for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in the Division of International Finance. Probably you know her because she was also present 4 years ago in the first conference in Lisbon in 2020. The paper she's going to present is co-authored by Stephanie Kurkuru, also from the Fed, and Bob Ressler from University of California, Davis. The title of the paper is Globalization and the Reach of Multinationals, Implications for Portfolio Exposures, Capital Flows, and Home Bias. Carol, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really... Okay, thank you so much. As was noted, this is joint work with my colleague Stephanie back at the board, and Bo Bressler, who's now a grad student at UC Davis. The standard Fed disclaimer applies. So this project grew out of our interest as analysts to try and understand more about these cross-border exposures and who's holding what and how and why. But then we started to also realize that the data that we're using for this, our standard balance of payments framework, may not be giving us really the answers that we want. And that's because balance of payments data, as we all know, is based on the concept of legal residence. But where a firm is legally resident may not tell you that much about what the firm's actual operations are and what they're involved in. So this is not really a new problem, but it's getting worse, and it's getting worse because of the increasing footprint of multinationals and globalization more generally. So we have multinationals that may incorporate in low-tax jurisdictions that have nothing to do with what the actual operations of the firm are. We have many firms, particularly from emerging markets, that may issue debt out of financing arms that are officially incorporated in offshore financial centers. And we, of course, have growing intermediation by investment funds, which tend to be incorporated in financial centers as well. Now, awareness of this issue is growing. We have, of course, the BIS, which has put out and sort of emphasized this issue by putting out their international debt securities on both a residence and a nationality basis, which really highlights the importance of that issuance via the offshore financing centers. And we have many people, of course, including people here in the audience today, who have done a lot of work on financial center intermediation and the role of multinationals. And there's also a paper by a bunch of academics, which has gained a lot of attention because of their work trying to restate global portfolios using mutual fund data from Morningstar. And this is actually highly relevant because for most countries, the cross-border portfolio is heavily driven by mutual fund holdings. For the US, that's about half of our foreign portfolio comes from mutual funds alone. And then several of these academics now have combined with forces with folks from the ECB, and Martin will tell you more about their project in a couple minutes. So our project in particular, we are going to exploit our access to the underlying security level data that makes up our balance of payments, our CPIS submission and so forth. And we're going to combine that data with commercial data sources, in our case, primarily from the MSCI, to recast these holdings, to think about how standard investment benchmarks would value these holdings. I want to give a shout out to the team back at the board that works on these data, because they have successfully moved this effort from what started as a research project to something that we do routinely for policy now. And we actually put these restated positions out, not just with our Fed's note updated annually, but they're also available on the official Treasury TIC website. So just to go over what this restatement looks like, I'm going to spend a little time telling you about this picture because you'll see several pictures that look the same. This is for common stock. On the left is our standard residence portrayal. Purple is what's coming out of financial centers. This is primarily Ireland, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and the Caribbean. Orange is what's emerging markets. Green goes to advanced foreign economies. When we restate that on a nationality basis, that's on the right. You see the purple share goes down a lot, so most of it's coming out of those financial centers. You'll see a portion that's growing in the gray. That's actually getting allocated back to the United States. This is coming from US multinationals that are legally incorporated abroad. In particular, there have been a number of high-profile, what we call the corporate inversions, when US pharmaceuticals bought smaller Irish pharmaceutical companies, inverted their corporate structure, called the whole thing Ireland. The important thing is the MSCI includes these firms in the US index. So we count them as Ireland if we're doing balance of payments methodology. MSCI says these are US firms. The larger share that's going to emerging markets is coming largely from Chinese firms that are incorporated in the Caymans. Think Alibaba, think Baidu, think Tencent. Those are all included in the MSCI for China. In our residence-based data, that would be the Cayman Islands. We do the same thing for corporate bonds. Here you see the financial center imprint is almost half of our corporate bond holdings, foreign corporate bond holdings. When we recast them, you get a large share that's going back to the United States. This is largely coming from US financial intermediaries that are establishing special purpose vehicles in the Caymans, specifically to issue collateralized loan obligations and other types of asset-backed securities. Importantly, the assets that are underlying these securities are US loans. So US syndicated loans, they're US credit card loans, they're US car loans. This is really exposure to the United States. The larger portion that's going to emerging markets reflects that issuance by emerging market firms via these offshore financing facilities. So in our data, for example, a lot of Petrobras debt is issued via the Caymans, and it shows up in our residence-based statistics as Cayman Islands exposure. And then turning to fund shares, well, you see that on residence, it's almost all coming from financial centers. Here, we're not going to try and do that at the security level. It's just too difficult, and it's awfully pretty opaque if it's in terms of some managed funds. So we're going to rely on mirror data. We're going to rely on what, for example, the Bank of Luxembourg puts out on their holdings of managed funds and the country allocation of that. We're going to rely on the same thing from Ireland and from the Cayman Islands. And you see, again, a large part of that comes back to being exposure to the United States or an increased exposure to emerging markets. When we put this all together, the distortions in the US portfolio are large. So by 2022, about $4 trillion, or about 30% of our portfolio, gets assigned to a different country when we do it on a nationality basis. And in aggregate, our holdings of emerging market securities are a non-trivial 30% higher. This is actually an important point to bear in mind. Now, this is based on US data, but global portfolios are going to be similarly distorted. Any foreign investor that's holding shares of those US multinationals that are incorporated in Ireland or in Switzerland are going to have that same problem. Anybody who's holding Petrobras debt issued out of the Cayman Islands is going to have that same problem. And this is going to make it difficult for us to understand things that we really care about in international finance, like what's driving portfolio allocations, what's driving capital flows. Does it make capital flows more resilient or less resilient, or how effective capital controls are? What are the spillovers of monetary policy and so forth? Now, this was a good effort, but then we got to wonder, is this really fully getting at what that sense of global exposure is? When we looked at the US portfolio, most of what US investors hold is domestic securities. So here we're going to look at common stock. We've been talking about allocating those dark colored portions at the top of those bars, but most of what we hold is domestic equity, including US multinationals. But US multinationals, of course, by definition, are doing business around the globe. And we know that investors think about the global exposures of those multinationals because, for example, Apple stock would move on days that there was particular news about China. So we know that global investors are thinking about that. So we thought, what can we do to try and address that issue? So this is what we call our nationality to revenue exposure recasting. So trying to recognize that US investors have substantial exposure to the rest of the world through the global activities of multinational firms. We now match those individual security holdings for common stock to data from WorldScope on the firm level activities. And in particular, we're going to use the geographic sales component of the WorldScope data to recast what those holdings reflect in terms of what the firms themselves are saying about the sources of their revenue. So for example, if a firm X says 10% of our revenue is earned from China, then we'll say, well, 10% of what you hold of that company's stock reflects exposure to China. And then we do this for all the firms, and then we add it all up. We have very good coverage for US firms because this is a reporting requirement for US firms. And we also have good coverage for foreign firms because they're required to provide this information if they want to list on US exchanges. And most of the big foreign firms do list in the US. So when we do this exercise, now we have our nationality on the left and our new revenue-based exposure on the right. The first thing that you want to see is that this is going to roughly double the measure of foreign exposure for US investors. And the second thing is, if you look at the size of the orange bars, our exposure to emerging markets is now roughly comparable to that for advanced economies. And that's going to come largely from the activities of these global firms. Another way to look at that now, I'm cutting it slightly differently. Well, it's the same as on the past. So now the yellow portions are like those orange portions to emerging markets. The green is still to advanced economies, but the darker shades are the exposure we're getting from directly holding equity of, let's say, a Brazilian firm or a Spanish firm. The lighter shades are the additional exposure we're getting by holding a US company that's doing business in Brazil or in Spain. So what we get out of this is that our indirect exposure coming from those holdings of US equity is as large as our direct exposure. So to illustrate why these kind of differences make a difference, let's think about a particular concept that we often use in international finance, which is the concept of home bias. So home bias basically says, according to the ICAPM, in a frictionless world, global investors should hold the portfolio, the global portfolio. In other words, the share of foreign equity in your portfolio should be the same as the share of foreign equity in world market cap. If that's the case, the ratio of that equation should be about 1. Then when you subtract that from 1, you'll get a number that's close to 0, which means you don't have much home bias. But in fact, research has shown that around the world, there's a lot of home bias. Investors don't do the ICAPM, and then the literature has tried to explain why that's the case, pointing to different frictions or hedging costs or market access or informational advantages about home country firms to try and explain why this is the case. What I'm going to point out is you're going to get very different measures of what home bias is, depending upon how you categorize the foreign equity in your portfolio and how you categorize the foreign equity in the global market cap. So here's what we get out of our data if we do it the 3 ways: residence, nationality, revenue. The dark red is our standard revenue-based measure, residence-based measure of home bias. It's very high for the US. It starts at about 0.7. It goes down a bit to about 0.65. That's still pretty high, and it's sort of fluctuated around there. If we do it on a nationality basis, that's the light dotted lines, it's actually even higher. But if we do it on a revenue exposure basis, that's the lowest line, it falls a lot. It's still there, but it's less than 0.5. And it's much more stable. So I don't want to say that one of these measures is better than another measure. It's just that they're different. And you're going to get different conclusions about what drives home bias depending upon how you measure this. So we do, in the paper, we do a sort of econometric exercise. We run a standard gravity model. We put in many of the standard determinants, and we get different results for the size and the significance of coefficients on things like trade shares or trade linkages or common language or informational advantages. This is just a sort of a note of warning to be careful about how we use these data and the conclusions we're drawing, because how these data are put together, it's going to make a difference. So in ongoing work, we're actually exploiting that link that we've made now between the stock holdings and the firm level data to try and draw out what aspects of firm behavior may be driving these portfolio allocations. So for example, is it things like capital investment? Is it things like productivity or intangible investment? Are those what's really mattering? And that's a topic for another day. But just to draw, just to conclude, our cross-border data are increasingly distorted. Our results are based on US investors and US portfolios, but global portfolios are going to be similarly affected. This has important implications for how we think about anything in international finance that draws on these kind of data. So understanding better exposure measures or more complete or alternative or just a better understanding of these things could help us in a lot of ways for a lot of the issues that we care about. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol, and thank you very much for sticking precisely to the 15 minutes. So that's been perfect. Thank you. So our second speaker is Martin Smith. Martin is a senior team lead in the external statistics section at the European Central Bank. He has worked at the ECB since 2010 in various areas. He's got a master and a PhD from Trinity College, Dublin. And the paper he's going to present is co-authored by colleagues from the ECB, but also from Stanford University Graduate School of Business and Columbia Business School. And the title of the paper is The Geography of Capital Allocation in the Euro Area. Martin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Juan, and also thank you very much to Carol for already introducing a lot of the concepts that I will mention in my presentation as well. To start this presentation, we have this very simple graph which shows the euro area gross external position, so the assets and liabilities relative to GDP, and how this measure has developed over time. So because we had financial globalization over the past decades, this measure has trended upwards for most advanced economies. And in fact, what we do here is to scale the euro area measure relative to an advanced country average. And what you see in the red line is that there was quite spectacular growth in the euro area external position. However, if we exclude just 3 euro area countries, so Luxembourg, Ireland, and the Netherlands, you see that the growth has been much less spectacular. And so this points to quite a complex story behind euro area financial intermediation and euro area external finance, which we explore in this paper. In this paper, we in particular look at the role of Ireland, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, which we term as onshore, offshore financial centers, OOFCs, because of course these are onshore markets within the euro area, but also we see a lot of parallels to offshore financial centers, so to more classical offshore financial centers. In particular, there are 2 major roles in euro area financial intermediation for the OOFCs. So the first one is that they are important hubs for the investment fund industry. And this applies in particular to Ireland and Luxembourg. In fact, funds in these 2 countries manage around 40% of the cross-border equity and bond holdings of the euro area, and also at a very large size at 7.5 trillion in assets. There's one interesting aspect when you look at these investment funds, that the ownership structure is to a large extent unknown. So for around 40%, we cannot identify the holders of the investment funds issued in these countries. The second major role for the OOFCs is the issuance of securities by foreign companies, so foreign companies that are setting up affiliates in these countries just to issue securities, mainly bonds. And when you consider the intra-euro area holdings of cross-border corporate bonds, securities issued in these countries account for a third, which is also quite sizable. So what we argue is that one has to look through these two roles of the OOFCs in order to better understand euro area external exposures and also to understand euro area financial integration. So we relate to a huge body of literature. So let me just mention this, and we have all these papers mentioned in the paper. But let me explain a bit our methodology. So we unwind all the holdings which are intermediated through the OOFCs, and we rely on a number of data sources. The first one is the ECB's Security Holding Statistics (SHS), which shows for each euro area country, so actually at the sector level, the security holdings at the individual security level. So also including the fund shares in Luxembourg and Ireland. To give an example, you can see that in the blue bars that Italian households, for example, are holding funds in Luxembourg and Ireland. The second information then which we add is based on commercial data sources that for each investment fund, we have the complete holdings of the securities of these investment funds. And this you can see in the red bar. So we combine these two data sources, and then we add an additional set of information which is based also on commercial data sources and links for all global securities, the issuance to the ultimate parent company and the country of nationality of this of these companies. So, for example, you see here security number 1 is issued in the Netherlands, but the ultimate parent is based in Germany. For example, there are companies like BMW that are issuing bonds in the Netherlands, so we would reallocate those to Germany. So merging all these data sources allows us to look through the entire chain of financial intermediation. So thinking about the observed euro area portfolio, and this includes the intra-euro area holdings, you can essentially divide it into 3 parts. So one is the direct portfolio of euro area investors. So if an individual investor is holding directly a bond or equity. Then the second one is the indirect portfolio, which is via investment funds. So exposures you gain through investing via investment funds. And the third part of the euro area portfolio is are the indirect holdings of investors which are actually based outside the euro area. So to show this a bit more concretely for the investment fund sector, so here you can see the investment fund assets of Luxembourg, Ireland, and Germany. And so, the first thing to note is that the size of the Luxembourgish and Irish investment fund sector is very large and has also grown quite dynamically over the past years. So as a comparison, you can see the size of the investment fund sector in Germany. Then we add information on the underlying holders of the investment fund shares issued in the 3 countries. So in blue is domestic investors, in red are investors from the rest of the euro area, and in green from the rest of the world, so outside the euro area. The first striking finding is that for Germany, essentially all underlying investors are Germans or based in Germany, while the ownership structure for the funds in Luxembourg and Ireland is very different, with a lot of investors from other euro area countries and even more from outside the euro area. Then we can add an additional layer where we observe where the investments by the investment funds are going, and also still we have the information on the underlying investors here. And just to point out 2 facts, so in the dark green you see investments coming from outside the euro area into investment funds, which are in turn invested again outside the euro area. So these are essentially just passing through the euro area, but are no meaningful exposure of the euro area investors itself. Another interesting aspect is what you can see in the darker red areas, because these are investments which are flowing into investment funds in Luxembourg and Ireland from other euro area countries, and in turn are invested outside the euro area or in other euro area countries. So this brings some kind of portfolio diversification for other euro area investors. Okay, so to give a concrete example how this looks like for the exposures of the euro area, we consider the case of Italian portfolio holdings, broken down by the destination country. So essentially, it's bilateral data, and as our benchmark, we use the CPIS. So our data are consistent with CPIS, which is of course based on the residency framework. So you can see here that Italy has portfolio investment holdings in German securities of around 57 billion. So if we do the nationality adjustment, so similar to what Carol presented for the US, this exposure increases slightly to 62 billion. Looking through the investment funds, increases the exposure to 85 billion for Italy. And doing both combined, we see an exposure of 98 billion. So that is an increase of around 70%. And of course, this matters quite significantly when you want to assess Italian exposures. Then there are more extreme cases. For example, for investment in China, the exposure increases from around 1 billion to 22 billion. So very large increase. And also for investment in the US, the exposure more than doubles. Of course, some exposures need to be reduced. And so we see here, of course, this comes from mainly Luxembourg and Ireland, where the Italian exposure compared to what you see in the official data declines by around 90% in the case of Luxembourg. Okay, we'll skip this. It was very nice of Carol also to introduce the home bias concept in her presentation, so I don't need to do that again. But we also, in fact, we are revisiting the home bias in the euro area. And what you can observe here in the red lines is the decline in home bias in equity on the left-hand side and in bonds for the euro area over the past decades. And this is these estimates are those that you are commonly finding in the literature. So very large decline in the home bias of euro area countries. And as a comparison, you also see that for the US and other advanced economies, you do not see a similar decline. However, the literature so far had to use a lot of assumptions. For example, on the indirect portfolio via investment funds. And so the standard method was just to assume that these fund shares are entirely claims on foreign equity. But there are two important biases. So first of all, the investments via investment funds actually are reinvested into domestic equity, partly. I mean, that's a small bias. But then also fund holdings include claims on non-equity securities, so bonds, cash, and so on. This actually has a big impact. And also, as we have seen, the portfolio holdings of Luxembourg and Ireland are to a large extent on behalf of investors outside the euro area. So this you should also exclude. So once we do these corrections, so in 2 steps, so the red dashed line is the final result. We see that the home bias reduction in the euro area is much less pronounced than what was estimated before in the literature. In fact, it looks quite similar to what we observed for the US. We don't have any revenue-based measures here, so I'm not sure how this would look like for the euro area, but here we see that the evolvement of the home bias is very similar to the one of the US. For bonds, we do similar corrections, but they are in fact much smaller. And here we still observe, so even after the corrections, the home bias in the euro area has been reduced very significantly. So this is also a finding in line with economic theory that with a common currency, that there is a big impact on the holdings of fixed income securities. Okay, so as a final point, because if you present on Luxembourg and Irish investment funds, you also have to address this elephant in the room that we don't know for a large portion of the holdings who are the underlying investors. So we also make some attempt to shed more light on that. This also links to these papers by Zuckman, for example, on the hidden assets held in Switzerland or other financial centers. So we have some data from Luxembourg and Ireland, which essentially shows the immediate counterparts of investment funds. So not the actual owners, but the first counterparts. So in the case of Luxembourg, there's more the country where the investment funds are commercialized or offered. So we, with our microdata, we try to have a revealed preference approach to shed a bit more light who these underlying investors could be. So what we see in this immediate counterpart data is that the UK is by far the largest counterpart to investment funds, both in Luxembourg and even more so in Ireland. And if you compare that to what is observed in the CPIS, so in the reported holdings of the UK, this is much, much smaller. So it's a huge gap. And yeah, Gian Maria will later present much more detailed on that. But just to mention that the key question is, so who is the UK investing on behalf of? And without going in much detail here, but we also have information for the investment funds. So where, in which countries they are in turn investing. And what we observe is for these funds, which are kind of going through the UK, or where the immediate counterpart is the UK, these are overweight into UK assets and in assets outside the euro area. So what is important for us, in particular for the ECB in terms of covering the euro area external position, is that it's very likely that these holdings intermediated via the UK are not held there on behalf of euro area residents, but more likely partly on behalf of UK residents and global investors from outside Europe. Okay, this I can skip as well. So we have much more in the paper, also in terms of econometric analysis, and also on the effects this has for companies. For example, if companies are issuing securities in Luxembourg and Ireland or the Netherlands, what impact this has in terms of the ability to raise capital. So it's much more in the paper. But let me just conclude that so we provide a new view on the capital allocation in the euro area. Particularly, we kind of look through these onshore, offshore financial centers using new data and also new methods. And yeah, we argue that these estimates are important to have a good understanding of the exposures of euro area external investment. Also, we provide some evidence for the role of currencies, so in terms of home bias in equity compared to bond, and have some new evidence on the ownership of Luxembourgish and Irish investment funds. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martin. Then we go with our third and last speaker, who is Andrés Sánchez Pacheco. Andrés is a researcher from Trinity College Dublin and the Sao Paulo School of Economics. And he's the chief emerging markets economist at JB Drugs Honoré. He's got working experience at different